Welcome to Her Remarkable History. Remember, to support our channel, please subscribe. The forgotten tragic wife of Thomas Cromwell. Throughout the reign of Henry VIII, the brutal and notorious Tudor monarch, he sentenced to death some of his closest courtiers and friends. Sir Thomas More could not support the king's changes to religion or accept Anne Boleyn as the Queen of England, and for this he lost his head on Tower Hill. But one of the most shocking executions during Henry VIII's reign was when Thomas Cromwell made his way to the same scaffold and was executed by axe. But years before this, the former chief minister and advisor to Henry VIII lost his head. Cromwell had suffered a significant amount of loss, as in 1529, his wife, Elizabeth Wyckes, died. She was the wife to the Earl of Essex, but we know so much about Cromwell and his life, and how he was instrumental in the execution of Anne Boleyn. But what's the story of his wife? Anne Wyckes was born in Putney, and little is known about her early life. She married her first husband, Thomas Williams, who was a yeoman of the guard, and these men are still today considered the bodyguards of the kings and queens. But Elizabeth did not have any children from this marriage, and it's not known what happened to her first husband. It is presumed that he died, as divorces were not common at this time in Tudor England, and they had to be granted by the superior parts of the Church and also the Vatican. However, around 1515, she remarried, this time to Thomas Cromwell. He had previously been working overseas, and Cromwell had been staying in the English hospital in Rome, and he had visited a number of European countries and lived amongst the merchants, learning different languages. But upon his return, he married Elizabeth, whose father was also a gentleman usher to King Henry VII. And with this, Cromwell now had links to the royal family. In Thomas and Elizabeth's marriage, they had 3 children that survived. The first was Gregory Cromwell, the first Baron Cromwell, and then they had 2 daughters named Anne and Grace. We know so much about Thomas Cromwell's life, but there is little known about Elizabeth's. She would die long before Cromwell's career reached its dizzying heights, being best friends of the Tudor king Henry VIII. Cromwell, during the early part of their marriage, was a successful merchant and also a lawyer, and it's believed he had taken over the running of Henry Wyckes' business, in which he was now profiting from Elizabeth's father's work. The Cromwells lived in London, and it's believed they had a very happy home, as they would also live with Elizabeth's mother, and it's believed to have been a very prosperous family home. Cromwell at this time was very wealthy, and he at times spoilt Elizabeth, buying her expensive jewellery, and he purchased her a sapphire ring and also a gold bracelet, with a jacinth worth £80. With this, it's believed that Cromwell loved his wife greatly, and his friends would often come around, and they would be entertained in the family home, with many merchants and scholars coming and spending time with them. Elizabeth and her mother were key parts of the social life also, and one of their friends wrote what great times they had with Cromwell and Elizabeth. There is a surviving letter that Thomas wrote to his wife, and in this it shows that the pair were happy and normal and very down to earth. But Cromwell also sent his wife a doe that had been killed whilst hunting, which apparently during the Tudor times was a mark of love. Elizabeth and Thomas Cromwell lived in Austin Friars, and as mentioned, she played a key part in Cromwell's life before he rose to prominence at the royal court. Shortly before her death, Cromwell had attracted the attention of Cardinal Wolsey, who saw him as one of the best lawyers across England, and Wolsey sought to get Cromwell on side and get him working for him. Cromwell would later usurp Wolsey as the cardinal fell from grace after failing to secure Henry VIII his divorce from Catherine of Aragon. It was at Wolsey's expense that Cromwell rose to prominence, and he was at the time making a name for himself in court circles and was seen as trustworthy initially. But as mentioned, Elizabeth Wyckes, Cromwell's wife, died early in 1529 at a young age. It is believed that she got unwell from the sweating sickness, which was causing problems in London at the time. Now, the sweating sickness was a common illness that caused severe fever, and thousands across England each year would die from it. However, what was also tragic is that shortly after the death of Cromwell's wife Elizabeth, his daughters Anne and Grace would also die not long after. It's believed that Anne and Grace also succumbed to sweating sickness, leaving Cromwell a widow, and also a man who now needed to also bury his daughters. In Cromwell's will, he made provisions for his daughters, but these were then crossed out. Interestingly, Gregory Cromwell, Thomas's son, would also die 11 years after his father was executed, as he also succumbed to sweating sickness. With this, the whole of Cromwell's family was wiped out by the same disease and execution. But Cromwell, following his wife's death, never remarried, and it's believed that his wife's death had a profound effect on him, and that he remained heartbroken by it for some time. To lose his wife and daughters in such a short amount of time was incredibly hard on him. There is a belief that Cromwell also had an illegitimate daughter, who was named Jane, and it was said that Cromwell had an illegitimate daughter, and beyond the fact that she existed, we know very little about her. She comes briefly into records in an incredibly obscure way. She is in the archives of the county of Chester. But her mother is unknown, and it's believed she was born whilst Cromwell mourned the loss of his wife. But in the months after his wife's death, Cromwell threw himself into work, and he became a royal favourite. With a number of years, he would then manage to oust Sir Thomas More from power, and also help manipulate the marriage of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. But Cromwell, 5 years after Elizabeth's death, became Henry VIII's chief minister, and he then launched his brutal triad and policy against the monasteries across the land after the king broke from Rome. Cromwell dissolved hundreds of abbeys, monasteries, nunneries and religious houses, making thousands of monks and nuns homeless, and in the aftermath of this, many abbots were slaughtered and were hanged, drawn and quartered. Cromwell genuinely seemed happy in his family life when Elizabeth was alive, but over time he transformed into a power-hungry and intimidating beast who could turn on anyone, and one of his greatest other crimes led to Anne Boleyn, the Queen of England and second wife of Henry VIII, being sentenced to death and executed by a French swordsman within the Tower of London. But Elizabeth Cromwell was a tragic wife of Thomas Cromwell, whose death had a huge effect on her husband. We don't know too much about Elizabeth's life, but we know that with her husband she kept a happy home, which was full of life, and many people who visited it enjoyed the company of the Cromwells. After her death, Cromwell would seek great favour with the king and throw himself into companionship with Henry VIII, meaning in his darkest days and hardest moments he turned towards the Tudor period's most notorious king. But Elizabeth Wyckes, or Cromwell's life, was cut tragically short from a disease that killed thousands throughout history, and also took the lives of her 2 young daughters days after she was killed. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.